Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Do More podcast. My next episode features a gentleman named Chandran Nair. Now, Chandran Nair is an engineer, an economist, an entrepreneur, and an academic. He has deeply analyzed the shifting economic and political sands in Africa, Europe, and Asia, including in Malaysia, where he was born. Much like CNBC, Bloomberg, the World Economic Forum, and the Club of Rome, I seek out and value Chandran's thoughts because they are independent, they are substantive, and always delivered with clarity and courage. He was the first guest on my podcast in 2019, and thus far the only one who has appeared multiple times, this occasion marking the third he has generously shared of his views. As always, I do urge all of you to approach the following discussion I have with Chandran with an open mind and constructive thoughts. Because while some of the points he raises might rankle, especially with the minority who benefit from the system, they are anchored by a mutual desire for real and positive change. Change which hopefully sets Malaysia up for a more sustainable future for all of us, not just the favourite few. One more thing. Do please subscribe if you can, and if you haven't yet already, and leave a constructive comment below, or two if you can. And of course, like and share it among your network and your friends, if possible. Thanks so much. And so now, without further ado, dear friends, may I present Chandran Nair. Okay, Chandran, we have been speaking on this podcast several times. In fact, you are the first person on the podcast, and justifiably so, because I come across your writings. I'd seen you on YouTube and considered your thoughts on Malaysia and the rest of the world with great interest and with great anticipation in chatting with you. And I think, thanks to you for doing this podcast with me. Again, I think this will be the third time. I want to just preface our discussion with the fact that you have the luxury of very lucid and very considered and nuanced thoughts on Malaysia, the region, and the rest of the world. But you also don't necessarily reside here all the time. So you don't get stuck in the minutiae of Malaysia, which can sometimes be a burden on us. I want to, kick off this conversation with getting you to maybe start off with your thoughts on where Malaysia is now, and in the context of your writings and columns. I think among them on Free Malaysia Today, and you've got a lot of opinions on where Malaysia is going, about our bugbears, about our albatrosses on our shoulders. And so I'm going to leave the ball in your court and get you to kick off the conversation with what's really in your mind about Malaysia right now.
Well, firstly, Chong, thank you for having me. And it's a privilege to come and share some of these ideas. I mean, to your point about not being stuck in the minutiae, because I live between two places. But the truth to be told, I've been spending the majority of my time in the last 3 years in Malaysia. And with it, comes both the great joy of being in a country that I think many of us don't appreciate well enough, in terms of the luxury of the diversity and all of those things, the safety and all of that. But with it also, for those of us who care and see the potential of the country, the pain. And so I'm pained often, and it'd be much easier to just turn a blind eye and just say, hey, I'm privileged. Why do I care about anything? So I think, to answer your question, though I don't live in Malaysia 100% of the time, at the moment I'm probably spending at least 60% of my time in Malaysia for the last 3-4 years. And so I feel the country's been very good to me from the day I was born in many ways. And I feel the sense this is home and one needs to contribute. So, recently I wrote a piece. My last piece for FMT was on the 3 R's. And I think it was titled, It's Time We Took Away the 3R Free Pass from Our Politicians. And it came...
The 3 R's being race, religion, royalty.
Race, religion, royalty. And it came about because as I was spending time, in Malaysia, some people read the stuff, some people follow some of the things I do internationally, etc. And I found myself in a position where even people in restaurants were coming up to me and saying, hey, you haven't written for a few weeks or few months, can you write one? And so this happened about 3 months ago, when all that stuff about socks, pardons, and non-Muslims should not be eating in public areas during Ramadan, and all of that stuff again, came to the fore. Former Prime Minister making bizarre statements about non-Malays not having contributed to the country. And I thought, oh my God, here we go again. And then people said, hey, why didn't you write? And I said, I have to find something that I feel strongly enough to write. And then a couple of doctors then wrote to me as well, when that whole thing about UiTM blew up and all of that, and said, this is, and of course many of them take a very race-orientated view, and I think it's important not to simply focus on race, but you can't avoid the race connotations and all of this. And I asked them, why don't you guys write, as I often do? And I found out that, most people are scared. So I had done something with FMT even before, just before I wrote this piece on the 3 Rs about the pardons. And the moment I wrote that, it was published, and then I did an interview, people told me, you got to be really careful, because they're going to come after you with the 3 Rs, because the pardon issue it's not something you can avoid talking about, the whole 3R thing. But I wrote it, I spoke about it, and nobody came after me. But then I noticed at the same time that when the whole issue of UiTM came up, that I think there was the leader of UMNO. I don't know who this guy is.
Zahid Hamidi?
Yeah. No, the UMNO youth.
Okay.
The guy was rabid and saying all kinds of horrible things. One wonders how someone like that can lead UMNO youth, but there you go. And saying all kinds of things that, most civil societies would not tolerate, or any organization worth its salt would reprimand someone who is supposedly a leader, inciting all sorts of things. But I noticed that this guy and a few others would always immediately go to the press and accuse others of having insulted royalty, having said something against Muslims and Malays and religion. And they would lodge a police complaint. But none of us would lodge a police complaint against these types of people for actually doing the exact same thing in terms of inciting racial, religious, and then bringing in royalty to support their stand when they have no right to do that. So I wrote the piece, and that was the starting point of a conversation. And in that piece, I essentially said that it is time that Malaysians stop being so meek. And I say that carefully because I'm not suggesting all Malaysians are meek, but I know from the friends I have and the people who write to me who are very influential or have nothing to fear, but still are so scared. And usually they're scared of something to do with race, religion, and royalty. They feel there's a red line there. They cannot touch it. And I thought, well, who put this red line there? Who waves this banner, this threat across everybody else that we can't talk about things in a civilized, constructive, and sensitive manner? So I wrote that piece, and, no one came after me. But I know it was widely read, and I want more people to be able to do that. But to conclude on that, I just said 3 things. That firstly, all Malaysians need to be schooled in some simple issues of governance in relation to the country. First is all citizens are equal, that the country does not belong to one ethnic race. This itself is apparently sensitive. You must not say this. Well, I've said it many times. The country is, I'm a citizen, I have equal rights. If people trying to take away those rights, that's called racial discrimination or discrimination of some sort. Second, that we have to understand that the political elite of the majority, in this instance the Malays, and I distinguish that from Bumiputra, the political elites of the Malay majority need to understand they have actually an obligation, as any leaders in a multicultural society would, to protect the rights of the minorities. And that is an obligation, so as to reduce any risk of the majority, which is, possible in many situations, exerting their self-interest in a way that is discriminatory towards the minority groups. And in this instance, in this country, that would be the Chinese, even though they're economically powerful, the Indians, and of course the indigenous people, of which there are many different ones, particularly if you go to Sabah and Sarawak. And finally, the point of governance that people need to understand is that the role of the state is to ensure that there is no racial minority or a racial majority who are targeted in ways that they are handed privileges that are unnecessary and not deserved, and that the role of the government is to make sure that when we do have affirmative action, and I've always stated, as I've stated in your programs before, that the poor Malays are in need of affirmative action. This has been abused. But at the same time, that affirmative action should be targeted and should not be at the expense of the minorities from other races, be it Chinese, Indians, and indigenous people. And that's the role of the government, that you do not just blankly say that we have one race that needs help and the others don't need, and we will do whatever is necessary. And that, I think, is an important point to make. So again, then I further go into the article to suggest that there are three these governance challenges are etched with three other challenges, and I'll just really quickly go through it. The first is the view among the Malay political elite that they essentially run this country and run it in whichever way they want, and therefore they have a free pass. That allows them all the excesses that we are all familiar with, and I will not go into it, but if anyone's interested, they can read it. Secondly, I said that this same elite have created a political system that allows for institutionalized racism, which is insidious and has been built into the deep state. And I'm not talking conspiracy theories, but it is built into it. And so that's the second bit that we need to actually recognize, and they have built it. And they've institutionalized racism. And I can later on explain that I don't think we should confuse institutionalized racism of the nature we have in Malaysia with apartheid and all of that. That's going a bit too far. We still have a pretty good system, but the institutionalized racism that these elite have put in place is now affecting the country in a bad way. And thirdly, these same people have now allowed that institutionalized racism to essentially erode all our institutions. And why I am so interested and committed in doing my little bit is to fight the erosion of the institutions, because meritocracy now does not matter in the most important institutions of the country. That means in government, we all know politicians come and go. Many of them are ill-equipped to do the jobs that they are given. We have ministers, with all due respect, who have no understanding of the portfolios. But if they are good managers, which is what a minister should be, and an administrator, then they get their best people to support them. Unfortunately, they are incapable of that because they are trapped in their racial and religious little bubbles. And so my point is, the third element is meritocracy must be restored. But the enemy of meritocracy in our country is the same political class and political elite Malays who believe that they owe something just to Malays. They're scared of the Chinese, the Indians, the indigenous people, and surround themselves with their own people. But even if they chose the best Malays, well, we'd all be very happy with that. But there has to be meritocracy in a multicultural country. You cannot have a civil service in this country which does not even in any way come close to representing the racial mix of this country. So those are the points right to make. I will just want to also say that it is important that we do not exaggerate the extent. The institutional racism is a fundamental threat to the country, in my view, and fundamentally because it basically does not recognize meritocracy, and it's right through the GLCs, right through the civil service, and there's rotating doors if you're in that inner circle. But we do not live in an apartheid state. I'm at pains to point out to people. I mean, I lived in Southern Africa. I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So we need to be careful as well, not to exaggerate, but not to, on the same hand, recognize the nature of the deep state institutional racism that has now taken root and is in my view the biggest threat to the country's well-being.
I always get a bit rankle, Chandran, when I attend some of these conferences, and it's invariably some kind of sustainability conference where the audience and panelists talk about the climate and this and that. But truth be told, the most unsustainable thing about Malaysia specifically are these encumbrances which you just described. None better, more exemplified in graphic form than the chart of the Malaysian ringgit versus the Singapore dollar or the US dollar. And that is a very graphic depiction of Malaysia's inefficiencies. Okay, I know there is no particular reference specifically to South African apartheid, but they are very similar in many respects. And yet, in South Africa, apartheid was dismantled, right? How does it get dismantled in Malaysia? Does it ever get dismantled? How?
Well, I follow things pretty closely in South Africa. I still have very good friends. I know a couple of people who were very close to Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu. I had the privilege of meeting the latter. I also did an interview in KL many years ago with Oliver Tambo, who was then the exiled leader of the ANC when Nelson Mandela was in prison. So we need to be careful. And I was recently talking to one of my close friends, and she was saying to me that in a way we discussed writing a book about what happened to two countries that have so much power, so much potential. I want to qualify everything I say by saying by making clear that people understand Malaysia is no way in the same position as South Africa is. But there are one or two little parallels. A black majority took over and then thought blackness would essentially be the only way forward, and cliques formed, elites took over, and they didn't allow for meritocracy. They allowed for essentially friends of friends and nepotism and incompetence to spread. And the South Africa, even during the apartheid era, as obnoxious as the policies were, the white minority built strong institutions which of course were used to oppress the black majority, but they had lots of these things. And what happened over the last 30 years in South Africa was the black majority thought power is ours, but did not have the experience to administer properly and did not bring the best black administrators in. So you always have a situation post-independence in many countries where elites come in and are incapable of moving from struggle to now development, right? In Malaysia, it was less torturous because we didn't have a violent revolution or things like that. But our elites were all trained in a certain way, and then we all know the history of the data is quite staggering. Someone gave me a piece of data the other day that at independence there was less than 2% of the Malay population that were involved in the formal economy. I mean, these all colonial sort of divide and rule strategies, and something dramatic had to be done, and those things did take place. But then what happened over the last 30 years is an elite, like in South Africa, I think, saw riches to be taken and plundered. And they formed a system whereby they essentially saw the power of using race and religion to maintain their power, perpetuate it, and rule the country. And UMNO is a classic example that has given way to different configurations, but not very much different. So to your question, can it be dismantled? I believe it will be.
I think the more
question is
important
how
issue
long.
is there even a will to dismantle?
I think there is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I like to think that I'm part of that will.
I'm not talking about the public. Obviously, the public, the general Joe public.
But the government is a representation of the public, and sometimes we deserve what we have. You know, that old saying, you get the leaders you deserve, right? So I think the public wants change. And now in Malaysia, as we all know, we will divide, and particularly in Kuala Lumpur and the Klang Valley, where we live in a bit of a bubble, right? And a lot of people don't fully understand the country at large. But we see everything as essentially there are the non-Malays who want to have change, and the Malays don't want change. I think that is changing rapidly. And so, I've been speaking to people from all segments of the community. And one of the things I'm very interested in is the amount of young Malays, who are tired of the system. At the moment, I have some, I deliberately get engaged with some young Malay professionals, all in their 20s, to get their views. I mean, they're tired of the racism. They all read my articles. They give me a thumbs up and all of that. Many non-Malays stereotype them, particularly if women are wearing hijab and all of that. They think there must be some sort of, pro-Islamic camp, etc. It's not so simple. And even the idea that everyone who's sort of joined the green wave, etc., must be some pro-Taliban movement, I think this is an oversimplification too, right? So I think there is a great will. I think people like us and many others have a responsibility to come and explain, and that's what I try and do. I wish my Malay was better, that I could speak to 10,000 young Malay students and get them really interested. And someone has suggested I do more of this as well to large groups, because then they don't hear enough about these issues from a diverse group of Malaysians. They listen to typically those Malay leaders who come to essentially incite the base, spew all the nonsense. And there are a lot of young Malays there who are not interested in that. They want a cleaner government. They want to see opportunities flow. And they want to see the country develop. I think it's incumbent on people like us to explain why their deal at the moment is a bad deal. It's poor governance. It's incompetence. It's nothing to do with race or religion. It is a system of elites who've used race and religion to capture the state. So I believe there is. I think your point is there's no one in government who wants to change it. I think there are lots of people who want to change it, and the fight is on. And we need to be patient, but we need to make sure that we are engaged and we're not checked out. I heard too many Malaysians, and I was talking to a couple of good Malaysian intellectuals yesterday who said the common phrase in Malaysia today is see something and say, sad, huh? And then that's it. Let's go and have some teh tarik and just enjoy life, right? I don't want to say it's sad. I want to say I'm going to try and help find a solution, confront it constructively, and help other people to mobilize. I think too many of us lead, despite all the issues, too comfortable lives, particularly if you're in, right? And we just check out, So I think we shouldn't.
So what you just described, Chandran, is actually very common in Malaysia, right? Oh, sad, don't do anything about it. Because by and large, and I'm going to, I guess, take a little bit of a contrarian approach. Not contrarian, but to play the other side, right? Which one must, right?
Yes.
Malaysia seems to function, right? It lurches from disaster to disaster, but by and large, the system allows everybody to share the wealth, because this whole Alibaba thing and work has to be done eventually, right? So it's done by everybody. Do you know what I mean, right? And also, by and large, the people disenfranchised, even among the Malay race, right, they do seem to benefit, at least in some small part, to the extent that they're happy. And then if they work a little bit harder, they get a bit connected, and then they can get into the riches. So it seems to be quite aspirational as well. So it's, in some sense, we might gripe about it, but we also, by and large, have some skin in the game to let it go on, the status quo. And that's the clever and strategic part about how the system works, right? And so that's why I say, is there really a will to do this? Because I've seen enough people, and one of the things that I am is very cynical, Chandran. I've seen things in the last 30 years which would make your skin crawl. I've seen people who are seemingly of good conscience and sound mind, and then they enter government, and then they become different people.
Yes.
And it's incredulous to witness, right? To which, how would you reply?
I mean, I've heard this argument, Chong, a lot. And I do think it has some credence. But I think those of us who are, pride ourselves at being a bit more than things are okay, should take a much wider view. And so I will just say, you say things work, the wealth is spread. Well, the wealth is not spread. So I'll come back to when you started this discussion, you talked about the ringgit. And but there are many economic ways to analyze that. Some would say, so what if the ringgit slides? There's different schools of thought and all of that. But the one I like to talk about is, what's Malaysia's GDP per capita? I think it's about 11.5 to 12,000 is the last I heard, right? What's Singapore?
75.
80.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at 75. Okay. What separates Malaysia from Singapore? I think
1.9
kilometers of water.
Yeah.
I think we breathe the same air, right? They drink some new water. We got some fresh water. But what separates us? Governance systems. So I'm not saying that a country like Malaysia can or should aspire to have 75,000 USD per capita, because at a larger global scale that would destroy the planet, GDP, resource use, etc. So you have Singapore, which is a nice kind of Disneyland, and it's good for Singaporeans and those Malaysians who want to go and work there, but and it's good for them, but it's a small place. We have a more complex thing. But a complex place which is blessed with resources, huge amount of resources, that is blessed with not having earthquakes, tsunamis, and think of our brothers in Philippines, Indonesia, etc. And now we have a GDP of about 12. You and I don't represent that. That we are the privileged, right? I would consider myself in the 5% or even more. So I'm 1%, maybe, very lucky. But the majority of Malaysians are really at the lower end, and it's too easy to say the wealth is spread evenly or even okay. Of course, Malaysia is not, and I have had the opportunity of being living in Africa in the 80s. I've seen some pretty dire stuff, war. I've seen starvation in Mozambique during the Renamo years in Zimbabwe. And I've had the opportunity to go to India many times. India is much better than it used to be. And I was in China when China was, dirt poor, right? So we don't have that. But we do have the risk of a very divided society. And I think we have an obligation, especially the privilege of us, to talk about a new way of spreading the wealth so that the GDP of this country may be 20 to 25. Once you get to 20 to 25, you have a very different society.
Income per capita.
Yeah, per capita.
So roughly 2 times where we are.
Yeah. Korea is about 25. Japan is about,
South Korea is only 25?
25, less than 30.
I thought it'd be more than that.
Yeah, but you can see the quality of life is very different because the basic necessities are all provided. So for me, it's not simply talking about those things. And I think I've said here, but I've been saying this a lot recently. we talk about, we got Tin Towers, we got another big building coming up, TRX, and whatever these buildings are. But you know that, simple infrastructure, even in the capital, does not exist. And the one that I talk about is, I would argue, until someone can prove with data, that 70% of all wastewater in the Klang Valley is not treated. 70% of all these people who go around drinking, posh coffee and tea in cafes and hang around and buying handbags, but most of that shit is not treated. So if you start looking at that, then if you look at the rural areas, then you see basic infrastructure. I'll start with the toilets, right? And then you start looking at quality of schools. If you want a society that progresses, you can't rely on an elite group of people living in the capital, because you have to look 30 years from now, right, at what it is. But people have a right to good education. That's being corroded. We all know that. Healthcare. Then we're going to have to talk about, you mentioned all this discussions about sustainability and all of that. Food supply and security. I mean, people in Malaysia might not know, but rice reserves in this country, I've heard various estimates, 21 days to 40 days.
Yeah,
I suspect it's about a month,
yeah.
Right? These are big issues. You need systemic change, which then should be linked to improving the quality of life, and therefore incomes in rural areas. You increase the GDP and all of those. So that's what we need to. That's what we need to do in anticipation. That's what policymakers should be thinking about, rather than this laissez-faire. Let's just keep it as it is. After all, it's all right. Right? But it's not going to be all right, particularly if you look, and I don't want to bring that in too quickly, but you look at the existential threats facing the world, and we're already seeing it. Great deal of planning needs to be put in place, which will create jobs, improve the GDP, etc. In our country, that the system that I described, and I've described before, the rent-seeking system of the elite Malay class, basically drains the country of fundamental resources that should be driven back towards improving the livelihoods, the basic rights of the majority, who are the poor Malays. And I think last year the Prime Minister cancelled a $7 billion flood mitigation contract.
Incredible.
Because he said it was not tendered. How on earth, right, do you get $7 billion contract issued without a tender? Whoever the minister was doesn't have $7 billion sitting in a safe in his room. That's not how money works.
Yeah.
So it's all the way up the treasury. In any other country that is, legit, people would have been fired, sacked, and gone to jail, right? So this is right within the system. And it was just, I'm canceling it, but I'm not going to find out who allowed this to happen, whose fingerprints are on this thing. That's the change we need to. Why? That $7 billion should have been used to provide for the underclass. And in doing that in the essential infrastructure, you raise the GDP, you raise quality of life. And at least that's what I think should be my contribution as someone who's privileged and, has an opportunity to do something.
Yeah, I think 7 billion actually. The biggest trigger point could be, imagine the multiplier that come from just buying books and distributing them.
Clinics.
All over the country. Okay, so what you said about the distribution of wealth being uneven is actually spot on, Chandran. And it's not just a Malaysian issue, it's all over the world.
All over the world.
It's precisely one of the main reasons why Macron in France is facing big resistance from our end. And the huge wealth divide is all over the world, right?
It's the larger question of,
in the UK,
capitalism gone wrong.
In the UK, average housing prices is 8 times eight times annual salary of the average Brit. In Malaysia, something like 30 times, which is incredible, right? Yes. So the wealth divide is real. I spoke to Bridget Welsh on this podcast some weeks ago, and she also mentioned these issues, inequality being one of the main possible catalysts for, I guess, disruption is a polite word, in the future. And she also pegs the risks of some kind of civil strife or some kind of race-related riot, and at quite a high level, worryingly high. Yeah. To which I want to ask you, Chandran, in terms of a trigger event or some series of trigger events or some kind of like developments, which would tip Malaysia into some kind of positive and material change for the better, what would some of those events be? What might they be?
I mean, it depends what you mean by events, right?
But we want a different Malaysia. We want we have
for me.
What we have is a functioning Malaysia at some level, right?
Right.
What we want is to take it to the next level.
Right. Right. So there's two things I would try and suggest here. The one thing I've always argued is, and I don't want to use, and we will talk about it later, but I don't want to use simply China as an example. But about more than 10 years ago, when he came into power, Xi Jinping, he recognized two things. That the expansionist open free market, but within Chinese characteristics model that had taken China, out of where it was during the Hu Jintao era, etc., had created massive corruption, widespread. Secondly, the corruption was at the center of the communist CCP. So he recognized two things. That China would essentially disintegrate if it carried on this way, and the party would disintegrate. So that would be they're both interrelated issues. So he took a big risk, and the big risk was to get rid of all the gangsters. And there is in Chinese circles a well-known clip or recording or release of a statement where in private he said to the Politburo, which is the 9 people, this is my biggest fight, I may not survive it. I got to take down these guys. And that was the governor of Sichuan, Wo Xilai, and all of those, and he took them down. These guys run countries, equivalent of countries. He took down the head of the military, took down the head of the railway corporation, which was the biggest infrastructure programs. He could have been killed. So for me, in terms of events, if you want to call it, you have to send a signal that we will not tolerate corruption. So if you find out $7 billion was not tendered, you investigate, you put all of them in jail. All of them in jail. Then you send a very, very strong signal. That, I think, will get the support of all Malaysians, except the elites who now feel that they are untouchable. Untouchable using what I call the 3R pass.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one way where political leadership must stamp its authority and get rid of it. But no one's gone to jail.
So what I'm saying is that you're describing actions, right? I'm describing events.
Events, okay. Yeah. So I was aware that, so kind of events arena would be, for instance, currently the awareness that amongst the more liberal, but I still think the ethnic-driven political power base in this country, that there's going to be some kind of Islamic wave, right? And it's already sent some shockwaves among some circles.
Well, there's a high possibility that PAS might govern the country the next election.
Yeah. And that too, I've heard contrarian views from some Malays intellectuals who are not pro-Islamic State, and they say that the Green Wave is a lot of young Malays frustrated with corruption. And their view, partially maybe misguided, protest, and that PAS being Islamic would get rid of corruption, right? Of course, we will all hello, but who knows, right? So, but to the other event, in my view, would be something really catastrophic that could happen in this country, that would trigger a questioning of the entire nature of how we are governed. And one would be the slide of the ringgit in such a way that no one can control it, that has sweeping turbulent effects right across the base. You and I may be protected, but would affect people right through the rural areas. But then the other type of event for me would be the staple runs out. Or runs out to the point that there is essentially not enough rice.
Two words just entered in my mind: Tahrir Square.
Yeah, things like that. There was a recent UNICEF, because Malaysians are very complacent. You can give them a lot of data about the slide in education, etc. I mean, the World Bank just issued a report last month, which you may have heard, which said that some of the data on education in the public schools is so in the Sekolah Kebangsaan, in the primary schools, is so dire. It's one of the worst. And what did the government do? The minister said, actually, we got it under control. And the data was stark, right? Anyone can go and check that, right? But Malaysians are so complacent. Everyone's like, hey, but the middle class and the upper class, my schools are in the private schools, so I don't care about this. The government's more like, well, they're all Malay kids. Who cares about that anyway? So we'll just say it's all right, you know? And then the other one, obviously, is there was a UNICEF report, which a friend of mine was involved in writing, which talked about the amount of food nutrition issues, which are big time. Again, people might say, so they're stunted, so what? The rural Malay people always not been too tall. They've always been okay. It's all right, right? But it's the 21st century. So those are kind of trends that we tend to ignore, but in other countries it'd be a wake-up call. The kind of event, I think, would be where food supplies run out, and basically a lot of people are hard-pressed to provide three meals. And that can happen just like that overnight in any part of the world. If you read some of the global data on food security, all you need is extreme weather patterns in India, Thailand, Vietnam for 2-3 years, and Malaysia will not have enough rice, right? So those sorts of things, but we should not wait for those things to happen, because that will trigger the change. But I hope we don't get there. What we should be doing is, in fact, planning for food security and radical reform. I don't see it happen, though there's a lot of talk. But some people even confuse durian and palm oil as food and margarine. That's the level of some of the discussion. So when you then talk about competence and meritocracy, the good people, where are those people? Right at the center of policy making. So, I think inevitably, as in most countries, trigger events are usually catastrophic. Mm-hmm. And the only one I can think of because we'll have a large flood and everyone will go, so it's been around for 30 years. So what, right? We will not have a large earthquake, but even if we do have, that's a natural event. The main one would be food, as it's always been in history in most countries. If you look at Syria, the revolution there, etc., a lot of it was food. They had a drought, food was scarce, and people got really angry.
Well, nuts and bolts, really. I mean, stuff that touches people's hearts, right? If they can't provide food for their families, then they take to the streets. Simple as.
Yeah, and the elite don't care in Malaysia, because we're all protected in our little bubble here, and we can all buy, exaggerated priced goods from wherever. The rich will import their own little buckets of rice. They'll have it ferried over from wherever. But the poor are already deeply disenfranchised. It'll only get worse. The question will we wake up? But you don't want to get to a point where, look at 1MDB. Was there a big protest in Malaysia? No. I spoke to I spoke to some Indonesian political leaders, and they said, in this country, if that happened, things would have been burned down.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And it's good. No one wants violence, right? But Malaysians are so placid, and I think this is, and because the majority are the rural Malay population, who are the most genteel sort of people around, but they've been taken advantage of, and so even education standards go down, food is bad, etc. Who cares? They're happy, because they have no aspiration, according to our political elite. And we'll just keep them happy, and we'll say, hey, when the flood comes, I'll come with my little boat, and I'll give you all a pack of rice. And then see you later next year when the floods return.
Let's talk about the region, Chandran, and zoom out into the wider hemisphere, right? You spend a lot of time all over the world. You've got a viewpoint on some of the biggest economies around Southeast Asia. You spend a lot of time in China. And I want to ask you how you're thinking about the region in terms of how you think about Malaysia in terms of the rest of the region. Very, very different country to country, but not homogenous. Some countries are moving much faster than the others. Vietnam, Indonesia, for example. Singapore is way ahead. How do we subsist in this competitive landscape, and how should we think about China? What are its aspirations in terms of the larger geopolitical space? I mean, how do they think about Taiwan? What do they think about Russia and the Ukraine? So I'm
there's a
asking
lot
you
of things there.
yeah. So I'm just okay.
Wait.
So maybe with the region first, right? Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah.
How do you think Malaysia should think about it in itself?
Well,
this region?
I do a lot of also development work in Malaysia. We run our annual Malaysia program. It's called Malaysia Stay and Build, and the whole thesis is to tell Malaysians, there's an exodus of talent from this country. It's not just Chinese and Indians; it's now Malays too. I have very good Malay friends who are all leaving, whose kids don't want to come back once they taste the Western lifestyle. Don't ask me why they think that's better.
Hang on. Well, France is in trouble. Germany's in trouble. The UK is in trouble.
But Asians are peculiar. They rather run away from the challenges at home, and Malaysia's challenges are not like Pakistan. So, and if you're privileged, my view is you should contribute. But Asians are very peculiar. They think if they seek refuge in some Western country, which might be I was going to use a foul word, but I would say,
anyway.
which is
more than
a third world country like Australia. So, they think that's cool, because it's okay to live with white people and seek whiteness, rather than stay at home and fight the good cause. So apparently, they will not fight at home. A lot of Hong Kong. I live in Hong Kong, so the transformation in Hong Kong. Tens of thousands of young Hong Kongers are left. For what? To go and live in Middlesbrough?
Yeah.
Then they go to Middlesbrough and they find out this is a dump.
Yeah.
And they go to Liverpool and thought it was a football team and find out it's a dump too, right? But it's okay. Because if you're in a Western society, you can pretend that because our colonized mind, that you have moved on to a more advanced society, despite how dire the situation is.
The grass isn't greener.
And you can send pictures, posing outside Harrods and Selfridges and pretend that you're living the good life. And then you don't have to fight anything. And you will tolerate the racism and all the other things that they endure and hide in your little Chinese, Indian ghettos, right? We all know this. But at home, you got a different mindset. Well, this is so bad here. And I don't want to fight this, because you don't want to put the hard work in. And so we created a program called Malaysia Stay and Build. My thesis, and I wrote an article about this 5 years ago in international media, I was actually speaking in Europe to a group of about 200 young professionals and young people from civil society. And two African guys asked me, brother, it's difficult here. What do we do with the racism and all of that? I said, go home. I said, why should these white people be nice to you? You think they're going to be nice to you? Some of them may be. But if you want to stay here, suck it up. But don't complain to me. But I said, if you're privileged, as you both are, and you've got degrees, stop complaining about racism and all of that, whilst enjoying the privileges of being a black man in the UK. There are some upsides.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So I said, but you should go home, and you have a responsibility to build your country. So in Malaysia, my view is many are leaving, but we ask them to stay and build in the country. So I think in Malaysia, when I talk about Malaysia, I argue that Malaysia is uniquely placed in the region to be, and now I'm talking traditional economic model of growth, etc. I will not get into the other stuff about what is the quality of growth and what kind of growth. But if you look at those traditional, conventional views about economic growth, Malaysia is uniquely placed, more so than Indonesia, more so than Thailand, etc. Are we leveraging that? No. If we are to leverage it, what's that unique nature of Malaysia? The multiculturalism, that ability of a Malay who can speak Chinese, a Chinese who can speak Malay and then deal with those people from Fujian, and Indians who can speak 2-3 languages, and Chinese who can go to India. So we have that, and that is what we should be nurturing, rather than saying if they leave, so what? So what? So we should bring all of these people back. If you're a highly qualified Singaporean and you left Singapore, my God, they want to know why. And my God, they're going to find a way to bring you back, right? But here, I know so many good Malaysians, and there is some organization called that tries to bring Malaysians back. What's it called?
The returning something, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like my talent
Malaysia, Talent Corp. Yeah. Well, I'm not the most talented individual, but I've never received a single letter from these people. Yeah. And I know many Malaysians.
They're reactive rather than proactive.
Well, I don't think they know what they're doing, right? And they're also stuck in their little R nonsense, right? So I know a lot of good qualified Malaysians who've never received a letter from Talent Corp. But if you're a Singaporean, you will receive it. So my point is that Malaysia could be a shining star in ASEAN in the next 20 years, in the world that we anticipate, if we know how to build on the uniqueness of Malaysia. But we don't. I think Singapore will be different, but Singapore is small. We are much bigger, 34 million, maybe peaking at about 38, 40. Imagine what that vision would be like. So I think it's a bright future, but we got to get rid of this parochial, race-based, incompetent, declining institutions and really focus. So Talent Corp, please send me a letter.
What does the world look like in 20 years' time, Chandran?
Difficult to say. I mean, at the moment, I'm very fixated on a couple of things, and which is why I set at an international level. That's why I set up the Global Institute for Tomorrow 20 years, in anticipation and in many ways of the world we live in. And the world we live in today, as most people may know, I thought about this when I started the Global Institute 20 years, that the rise of the others, the non-Western world, would essentially freak out the West. And we see that today. So I called it, the post-Western world was arriving. How will the West react? And even I didn't anticipate that they would react in such a violent way, in a way, right? And we can see this now, particularly in the reaction of the West, led by the United States, against the rise of China, right? So, and next it'll be India. So the other one, obviously, is the convergence of all the existential threats, the root cause of which is an economic model that doesn't price in, right? Threats, externalities, and carbon, etc. So the world that will look like, what the world will look like in 20 years is difficult for anyone to predict. But what we do know, at least from the scientific point of view, it'll be a hotter world or warmer world. The last year, 12 months, each month has been the hottest in recorded history. Each month, not as an average over the year, each month. It'll be much hotter. So that we know for sure. Then the question is what the world will look like will depend on how we seek to adapt. How we seek to adapt. I don't see many countries seeking to adapt because they're caught. If you're in India at the moment, you are looking to essentially try and feed 1.5 billion people. You are then deciding which sort of economic model you want to adapt to. The Indians are following the, let's get all the foreign direct investments and all that. I think this is very dangerous. If you're China, you're now looking at the last 30 years, we struggled. We lifted people out of extreme poverty. We have some incredibly good technology. What next? And I think the Chinese are completely aware that the existential threats, apart from the geopolitics, but the geopolitics also related to existential threats, who controls what, is priority number one. So I think each country has got to define it. But at a global level, clearly it's going to be much hotter, right? It'd be a very hot world. Then the question is, resource scarcity will hit us hard. We have to try to adapt to how those resource scarcity issues are dealt with, which have geopolitical issues. And without being scary, if we do not essentially adapt to what I call understanding limits of the natural systems, we will create more health risks, health threats, epidemics, pandemics coming out of natural systems because we don't respect those boundaries. And I don't think that even if we started today, we will be able to, for instance, deal with in the next 20 years with the extent to which we have already, for instance, damaged the oceans, etc., microplastics, and all of those things. So I see a world in which we have so much to do, but the next 20, 30 years is going to be very tough, very tough. And that is not to be pessimistic, it's to state the facts. And then the optimism, I think, comes from, do we want to do something, or say, as we say, just very sad, I've got nothing to do with it. And what I see, I know you interview a lot of corporate figures. I think most of them are in denial. And I am loath, and I don't want to be too harsh, to call them leaders. Because leadership is something very different. These people, most of them are corporate managers. Many of them are my good friends. They are bean counters, looking after how many beans, get shoved into my little purse at the end of the year because I match some petty little KPI. And I think leaders are very different. They see a different worldview.
They lead.
They lead. They change.
Yeah.
They change things, right? And I don't see much of that. And that's why I've argued leadership has to come from the institutions of the state. And the institutions of the state have to be the most important institutions that we can have. The private sector is not going to solve climate change.
Well, institutions are led by people, right?
People.
And the people, by and large in this country, we don't have those statesmen anymore. We don't have those leaders anymore.
They will come. I'm optimistic. They will come. But it depends at what breaking point do we unleash them. And so you have to be optimistic. I cannot, turn up to work every day subscribing to the idea that it's game over. No. I subscribe to the idea that it will be tough, as I said, but all of us, by contributing ideas, challenging the status quo that got us here, will unleash things that we do not anticipate. I remember 15 years ago speaking to my Indonesian friends when they had, I think, 6 presidents in about 4 years or something. They said, our country is gone. There's no hope for us. Then out of nowhere, this guy turned up called Jokowi. And he's not perfect, but he'd be a good prime minister to have in Malaysia. The equivalent, right? Simple life, didn't accumulate a lot of wealth, etc. But you need visionaries. You need visionaries, and they're coming. And I was recently at a talk given by Giorgio, the foreign minister. In my view, one of the most intelligent intellectuals, in the world. And he said something to a large foreign audience, which of course shook a lot of people. They asked him, so where do you see leadership? And he said, well, I think there are 2 or 3 great leaders in the world today. And he said, number 1, President Xi. Of course, all the Westerners, all the Guailos freaked out, right? He talked about, and then he mentioned MBS, Saudi Arabia.
He got rid of those gangsters as well. He got rid of gangsters as well.
He's got rid of gangsters, and he's telling all the masjids, you start behaving. He's told the Wahhabi guys, you stay in your corner. I'll take care of the rest of the stuff. He's doing a lot of stuff there too. So I think there are people coming up. I mean, Singapore.
MBS meaning being Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi.
The Crown Prince, right? Which, again, you can't even mention in the West because apparently he killed this guy and therefore he's a murderer, right? But no political leader transformed anything, didn't have bit of a blemish on their record. But you have to look at the larger picture. I'm not excusing if he is responsible for that murder. I don't know. But there are leaders, and they will be unconventional. They will not be what we liberals, educated Asians in the Western, canon, in the Western traditions believe. What is it? They'll be very different people, and I think they will come. And in Malaysia, I can see some talent coming, and I hope we will not have to wait too long for that group of people to emerge. But we must abandon the race and religion fixation.
How do you look at China and its ambitions in terms of foreign policy?
For me, I'm very I'm not a China basher. I think that I'm on record for being that. Partly because I went to China when most things were broken, first time, 1989, right?
Oh, Tiananmen.
And
you must have been there. You could have been near the action.
Yeah, but Tiananmen too, and I think there's a narrative about Tiananmen which is not the Chinese narrative. So I'm also highly suspicious, and I've read extensively from people who were there, etc. But Tiananmen was a walk in the park compared to what others have done in other countries, right? So I'm not excusing it or whatever, but there are narratives here. What I meant was, going to Guangzhou, going to Gansu province, etc., when everything was poor. So what I've observed as someone who's interested in economic policy making, and how countries essentially merge, and having lived in Africa, then coming to Asia and going to China, is what systems of governance actually work and what responsibilities they have. And for me, China's achievements the last 30 years are unprecedented in human history. And that's not just me saying it. Go to the World Bank data and all of that. So I see China as a really interesting example of how large nation states with all those complexities have to navigate and what political systems they choose. And I think the Chinese system suits China. I don't think China, and because it's big, it'll of course have a footprint. It'll scare some people. But I don't believe China will wage war. I don't believe. And I have argued that the Western fear-mongering is essentially a reflection of Western history, the militaristic history of conquest, and they believe everybody else will do that. I don't think China will invade. What China has to be careful about is its power inevitably morphing into the need for more resources, and therefore even usurping some elements of what people think are their sovereignty, etc. And I think the Chinese are very, very conscious of this. And I do some work at the moment with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Chinese government. And my advice is always to them that the Western media is, if I didn't know better, racist almost to the point of hating Chinese people. It is just, you can't say a civilization that old with all the results is wrong on everything. But you can't read anything positive about China. Open The Economist, The New York Times. It's almost racist, xenophobia. So when I'm asked, and we are running a conference for the Chinese Foreign Ministry starting next month, I'm happy to share with you. You can share with your readership a virtual conference, really looking at these questions with the Chinese Foreign Ministry wants us as an independent to organize, bringing in speakers who are essentially objective, because there are no conferences about China that says, well, what is China really like? Rather than, the economists and all of these organizations running things, and they bring in people who just criticize China. So my advice to China is to be extremely careful about the power it has and how that power untowardly affects its image. And I'm particularly conscious of Chinese companies and I've told them, working in different parts of the world, who are not sensitive to many of the issues, and it's happened in this country. But the one good thing about China that I therefore try and leverage and try and get them is, if the Chinese government says, my God, this is a risk to us, it has the power to essentially whip these guys into shape. But one thing we also have to understand is, if Rio Tinto from Australia, indulges in some banditry in Papua New Guinea in mining, and there's a long track record of that, no one says, the Australian government is responsible for this. If Goldman Sachs is involved in all that fraudulent stuff and we've been victims, no one says that's the U.S. government and that's the U.S. president. But when Chinese companies misbehave, as they do, then apparently, the President Xi, that communist dictator, is responsible for ravaging the rest of the world, etc.
TikTok, for example.
Yes. So I think China is. I think China has a different culture. I don't think it's. Look at all the provocation it's had to suffer for 5 years, and it has not fired a single bullet. And particularly because I'm in Hong Kong and I speak internationally quite a bit, I'm asked about Taiwan and all the provocation to get China to invade Taiwan. I think the idea for China of Chinese people killing Chinese people, no.
How does China look at Southeast Asia? And how does it, I think much more pertinently, how does China look at its diaspora of 7 million Chinese in Malaysia?
Yeah, in terms of, I read that this week, I think Malaysia and China came to some sort of understanding about the South China Sea. So I think the South China Sea issue in Southeast Asia, China, in my view, will essentially listen to every nation in this region, so long as the Americans stop interfering and trying to incite. What on earth are we in this region doing, listening to a country that is essentially a war economy, in my view?
Yeah.
Look at Gaza. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist. Sending boats to our part of the world and trying to incite some sort of tensions between the 11 countries of ASEAN and China. You think we're fools that we don't understand diplomacy, that we can't talk to our Chinese brothers because we're all interlinked? And that brings me back to your point about the 7 million here. There are lots of links between China and Malaysia. Lots. Indonesia too. Thailand. All of Cambodia, Philippines.
Yep.
So my view is that the diaspora plays a very important part. I think China sees that. And in a piece of work I did for the Chinese Foreign Ministry last year, I did say to the Chinese Foreign Ministry that they need to leverage soft power of China more than hard power. And they should not fall into the trap of reacting to the usual Western instigation. And they should just negotiate, talk, and use soft power. And Chinese soft power is immense, and China doesn't use it.
Well, that's the thing. South Korean soft power is
K-pop,
very,
yeah.
K-pop, for example.
A small country, yeah.
Yeah, British soft power is, Wimbledon and David Beckham, for example, right? What is Chinese soft power?
Chinese soft power, in my view, is art and culture. Art and culture. And Chinese culture and traditions are so extensive that most people have only seen the tip of the iceberg. If you go to China, and
I've been there twice in the last 1 year.
Yeah,
I was blown away by the development.
Yeah, well, that's the urban. That's a completely another world of development, and it'll put most of the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, to shame. I'm fascinated by toilets because I think toilets are an indicator of progress.
Yeah.
And having been to China, 30 years ago, where if you're stuck in a village and you got to go to the toilet, well, be brave, okay? So, and now you go to China, right? And after COVID, I was in China and I landed at Chengdu. I went to the toilet, Star Trek.
Star Trek, yeah.
Oh, Star Trek, the design and everything. And then I go to rural areas of China in like the poorest province is Gansu province. and you go into the mountain areas, up on the highways, and there's the public amenities, and you get off, and you can smell the Dettol 1 kilometer away. There's two blokes there cleaning endlessly.
Yeah.
And, they have metrics like 3 flies and you're out. This is in rural areas. So they're just that infrastructure. But what I am talking about is so many people don't understand how deep traditions are being preserved in parts of China, although they lost quite a bit in terms of arts and culture. So I was saying to the Chinese, some people know about only in China and ancient civilizations like India, you have such perversions in terms of art. Let's carve something into this grain of rice, and it's going to take us 3 years, to do it. Let's paint something really complex into this little bottle, and you got to do it upside down. All those kinds of, and then only you're a sifu. If you just paint something, right? Okay, everyone can do that. You got to do something like that. Those Chinese traditions and those deep cultures, art is not being promoted around the world. And I said, just get that stuff out. I've seen stuff in rural parts of China done on stones, and I've even seen, and I've purchased some, the old tradition of painting with your fingers. Amazing art. So I said to the Chinese, you guys should take rural communities of artists from China and get them to these countries to show and buy out rent out the biggest space and show the people of the world what Chinese art and culture is. And then, of course, the performing arts, music. And China doesn't do that, and Chinese movies that are made, which are not about war anymore, all of those things I think China should do and show its soft side, not to mention, of course, the food, which, all we know typically is noodles and some Chinese dishes. But, if you travel around China, you'd be surprised at the variety of halal food you can get, the Buddhist food, the vegetarian food, and all of that. So I think that's Chinese power, and they should leverage that in terms of what they do in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, unlike the Americans, that's one thing the Chinese are not good at, which is marketing.
No,
They're
China
very bad
doesn't
at it.
understand PR.
Yeah,
Zero.
yeah.
I mean,
wanna
a
ask
lot
you-
of PR is about deception.
Absolutely.
So
Perception management,
deception,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And Americans invented it.
Yeah, exactly. I want to ask
buy
you,
things you don't need with money you don't have.
So I want to ask you about the U.S. elections, right? November, right? Trump seems to be leading, but whoever comes in, both will have very different approaches to foreign policy. Asia, China, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, right? How are you looking at the U.S. elections?
Again, I'll go back to, I've always believed that Trump would be better than Biden. Liberals don't like it, but there's some peculiarities about Donald Trump. I don't care about what Donald Trump says and does in the U.S. I couldn't care. I was in the U.S. on the day that Donald Trump was elected. I was doing a talk with all kinds of liberals. And of course, they were all horrified that their darling Hillary Clinton was not going to win. And they asked me, what do you think? I said, I couldn't care who you guys elect, because usually they're losers. But the point is, which one is likely to throw bombs on my part of the world?
Yep.
That's all I'm interested in. And one thing Trump has made clear, he talks a big talk, but he doesn't like war. He doesn't like killing. So if you see, during his 4 years, he didn't start a war. So Biden has been a total disaster, but I don't think it's Biden. I think it's a deep state. I mean, if you look at the guy walking, I mean, he's on the other side, half of it already.
Yeah,
he's on the astral plane, right? He's with Buddha.
He's got
half
some
there
serious
with
cognitive decline going
yeah.
on.
So a corrupt system that does not allow someone with a reasonable sense of judgment to run for president. So my view is, and George Yeo said this too. Someone asked him, who would the Chinese prefer? He immediately said, Donald Trump. Because with Donald Trump, you know what you get. and
all his cards are there.
All his cards are there. And Chinese like that. They can deal, see which one, and bombastic, but we'll see what deal. And you can pander to the ego and all of that. With Biden, you don't know which Buddha he's talking to on which day, right? So, and so I think Donald Trump would be better for the world. He might not be better for the USA, but I'm not worried about. I don't care about the USA. I'm more worried about what's that war machine going to do next? How many wars will it create? And I think Donald Trump is not driven so much by war. And I do think that the Ukraine war would probably have not started if Trump was in power.
I agree with you, actually. I just heard him on the All In podcast this morning, and he said that if he came to power, he would not put any American boots in the Ukraine. And he also said very clearly that he would work with China, and they would have a win-win situation, and he would not start a war with China. So I think you are pretty spot on in terms of your evaluation of him. He doesn't. I mean, he's a businessman ultimately, right? And war is not good for business.
No, I don't know if he doesn't smoke. No. He doesn't drink alcohol. He's a weird guy.
He's a weird guy.
But all I'm interested is that he appears and apparently doesn't like killing. Which is a good thing.
Which is good. And they can't afford it either. Anyway.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up, Chandran. How are you positioning yourself personally? Yourself and your business, because not only are you a concerned citizen, you're also an economist, but also you're an entrepreneur, right? And for the business class and people like yourself, so who have skin in the game, because you are also Malaysian, how are you positioning yourself for the next 10 years?
Well, people like me, I mean, I've been lucky. So at one level, and I'm also of the view that how much is enough. So, especially if you live in Malaysia. So I'm not chasing more money, not that interested, but coming from a privileged position. But I know many who are more privileged than me and can't help but chase the silliness, right? Yeah. I think it's a consciousness issue, and I talk quite a lot about it. There's not enough consciousness in elite business forums. And they've all been dumbed down with all that MBA nonsense, and they all went to Harvard Business School and learn the flat earth society rules. And then they come over here and pontificate with all the same old jargon. I'm not that. And we have business schools all around who do the same. At the moment, my main focus, and thank you for asking from a perspective of entrepreneurship. So I started the Global Institute 20 years ago now. And the whole point was to create a different narrative for understanding, to understand, help people develop. We run all these leadership programs. Last month, I was in West Papua looking at a different model for floating hospitals. The whole Raja Ampat area, which everyone goes to, but just behind those beautiful beaches and those cliffs are people who've never seen a doctor, right? So looking at, not charity and philanthropy, but looking at different business models for healthcare. And we worked at the global insurance company in terms of educating their new leaders who have no idea what all of this stuff looks like because they're all trapped in their little KPIs and meeting their quarterly results. So having said that, over the last 20 years, we've built a very different narrative, one that is not offered in any Western business school, etc., which cuts deep in to what the world is going to look like in 20, 30 years and what we'll have to do. Those who oversimplify think this is something to do with the environment. It's much more complex than that. So 2 years ago, I raised some capital. So anyone who are your fan club, who's got some money, would like to invest in something unique, is Malaysian. We took all of that content and built an education platform, and we called it Redesigning Society and Disruptive Learning. Not the kind of thing you would say if you're trying to sell chocolates and coffee, right? Not the most seductive, but provocative in terms of wanting to attract people who are interested in actually making a contribution through the lens of how economic models work, how business, and what leadership looks like. So I raised about $2.5 million US. The company, the main investor is Singaporean. The company is registered in Singapore. Again, I would rather have it in KL. But the good news is the team is in KL. So I have about 20 people in KL building that. We went live about a year ago. And coming back to Malaysia, I'm trying to get one Malaysian entity to invest. No. Right? I go to Khazanah and no. Right? I'm not asking for 10 million US dollars. I'm asking for one, just to put the footprint. And I even offered, if a Malaysian entity invested in it, this curriculum is new, and in fact, I'll send you a link if you want to share it with your audience. And I even offered to then do a Bahasa version, which you can do today with technology, and offer it to all the universities. Basically, it's critical thinking. It's reimagining all the stuff we talked about and linked to local condition. I couldn't get anyone interested. But if I had come here, if I have a new startup selling durians with a bit of cocoa and a vanilla from Raja Ampat, they might invest. With lingerie tied in, then they might come in. So my thing is to, having opened the door, having had recognition for our curriculum to become the new sort of definitive way of thinking about the future. And in recognition of that, we are looking at MOUs with leading institutions. And last month, and I'm pleased that Cambridge University signed an MOU with us in terms of knowledge sharing, but because they recognize that what we're doing is essentially something that no one's packaged to ask the really hard questions. So that's what, and I also signed an MOU last month with Singapore Management Institute. But I don't have any Malaysian take-up, so please use your influence to get someone to understand.
You're assuming I have influence, Chandran.
Oh, your podcast is really famous. So that's what I'm trying to do. And, from a business perspective, again, this is counter to most. I'm not looking to make money. I'm the major shareholder, and my intention in the next 3 years is to give away all my shares to others. And the business model is also different. We're a startup, but we're not looking to essentially do an IPO and all that hocus pocus nonsense. We're looking to establish an institution that will last the next 30 years, which will take this narrative changing curriculum to a whole different dimension. It's science and economics based. And it's also very interestingly, if you go to any leading e-learning platform that are popular around the world, like that masterclass stuff and all of that, you'll get celebrities, and you'll get essentially 9 out of 10 of the experts will be Westerners. I was completely different. In my first course, say I have 10 speakers, I have 2 or 3 Westerners, I have people from Africa, Malaysia, etc. And the point of the narrative is to say models built out of the UK and out of little places called Boston don't work in Jakarta. They don't work in Chengdu. They don't work in Morocco. We have to listen to the people from those countries, and that actually there are great experts, wisdom in those places. You all need to listen up. And that's kind of what we are trying to do. So that's my plan. We are now raising a bit more capital, our first round, and hoping to essentially have tens of thousands of learners in the next 12 months. That's my plan. That's my biggest ambition now, to get this narrative out worldwide, make it a world-class brand. I say with all humility, there is nothing like this out there in the world. We're the first. But it is in your face learning. Because a lot of learning today is essentially also deception. So it's more like I learn chemistry, but what do I use chemistry for? So chemistry is science. What I kind of depict what we're doing is this. You can have a PhD in chemistry. What do you do with that knowledge? You can go and build a bomb. You can go and work for an arms manufacturer and be part of the war industry. You can go and try and do some more exotic chemistry to find a new paint that is more thermodynamic than the last one, so that Tesla can buy it. It's a complete waste of talent. Or you can go and essentially do chemistry that starts reducing the chemical industry impact on the agricultural sector, which is huge, right? The chemical impacts of chemicals we use today are so significant. You could go and devote your chemical knowledge to that, or even better, you could go and invent the waterless toilet, which will need some pretty advanced chemistry. So that's what, rather than the education mainstreaming, which essentially takes people into the same old trajectory, unconscious sort of development. What we call it is purposeful innovation, using your knowledge. And there are lots of bright people who are stuck in the groove at no purpose and not doing much. And that's what we're trying to do by exciting people. Yeah, so that's the mission at the moment. It's hard because that vision is so big. It's almost scary for people who know. And the other problem is many large organizations. It's a B2C model at the moment, so that companies buy large amounts of subscriptions. But many companies are not organized in that way, and they also don't have the ability to decipher the difference between. You just go and say it's digital, so they think you're just an e-learning platform. But I say digital and e-learning is just a channel. The thing is, what are you learning? And so they say, well, we have too many e-learning. I say, okay, but you can have e-learning for, how to, on art, chemistry, or physical fitness. That's not the point. The point is, what is the content? And most organizations are not geared towards innovation in terms of new learning. And that's the best kept secret of large companies, that they are actually timid and scared.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more we can discuss, Chandran. Just even the raison d'etre of the private sector. And I think you've written about this as well. That's another 2 hours worth of conversation, but suffice to say, you will be back for the 4th time, 100%.
Thank you.
You're always lucid, you're always nuanced, and always considered. And I think the best thing about you is you're very clear in the way you think. So thank you once again, Chandran, for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. Real pleasure. And, the essence of what these opportunities that someone like you provide is to try and contribute something useful. So in Malaysia, for me, it's let's get the best people doing the right jobs.
Yeah.
And in that way, strengthen the institutions, and that way enable the majority of the population, the increasingly disenfranchised, to realize their potential. They deserve it, irrespective of race, religion. That's, for me, the simplest way of describing why we need to oppose these politicians who use the 3R. We have to challenge them all the way, because they are a hindrance to the progress that the majority deserve, because they weaken our institutions.
Yeah. Man, thank you.
Thank you.